So how can we avoid falling into a kind of dismal depression about ourselves if we're always seeing the best in other people? Is that the question? If we're always seeing the best in other people and are suspicious of ourselves, is there some degree of self-care or self-respect, self-image that we're entitled to maintain? Yeah, this is something that counsellors often speak about, and it depends on the individual. There's a certain type of person that really doesn't care about himself and doesn't think about himself and thinks, well, I'm just rubbish, but look at these wonders in creation, let me focus on those, focus on worship, and comes out of himself all the time. The the self in a certain way isn't actually real anyway. It's a set of stories about itself, poorly reconstituted memories. When you actually look at what you are, what is the precious essence of yourself, you find something that's a kind of broken spider's web of dusty, half-remembered relationship. There's not anything very substantial there. So the sages in every age have often said, well, this self of mine is really not a very interesting thing. Let me admire the selves of others, or praise God, or love beauty, or become a great craftsman, go out of the self, so they never even think about themselves. Nowadays we have this big focus on the self, individualism, the identity, self-respect, which is often just a paraphrase for egotism. Feel good about yourself. I find that personally uninteresting, but some people do need it. So it depends on the individual. My preferred strategy would just to say, well, I know I'm rubbish, but look at these things that I can do for others and these texts and the beauty of the world, and come out of yourself rather than focus on it. Mm-hmm. That's true, yes. And that's why the Sharia gives us certain basic rights. We have the right to property, we have the right to wealth, we have the right to dignity, honor. These are things that the Sharia does recognize. We should think of them in terms primarily of other people's rights, rather than constantly looking out for ourselves. But at certain points we have the right not to be humiliated, not to put up with insults. If somebody starts beating you up, you have the right to defend yourself. That is the case. But the modern world has got this very out of balance, whereas the traditional civilizations were very skeptical about what's actually within us. The Buddhists basically don't believe that there is a self at all. We begin in Buddhism with meditation, and it is the self that meditates. But the final point is what they call anatta, which is that you realize that you're not there in the first place, in which case what could self-regard possibly mean? We do believe in Islam that there is a self, there is a soul, and that it is in some sense in the divine image and reflects the divine nature. But the respect for it is the respect for the ruh, so we respect what we are called to be, rather than what we are at the moment. But with a lot of people who are insecure and thinking about themselves a lot, or who are being challenged a lot, it's difficult to say to them, as the Sufi did in Ghazali's text, "Utruk nafsaka wa ta'al," which is Bayazid. God says to him, leave yourself behind and come to me. Well, how can I leave I? It's a paradox. What is it that's coming to God if the self is left behind? Which is the paradox of selfhood, of the NAFS. Because NAFS means self. Without it, what is going on? So these are subtle things. And I think each spiritual guide will issue a different kind of spiritual food to people in connection with this. Some people do have a sense of the self as something bruised that needs to be protected, that needs to be built up, that needs to have more confidence in itself before it can operate correctly. Other people say, well, I know I'm rubbish, but I really like to feed the street dogs, or whatever it was that Baha'u'ddin Naqshband did. He came out of himself by living with the sick dogs in the streets for 7 years, and everybody thought he was crazy in Bukhara. He didn't care about himself at all. He just wanted to be with the sick animals. And the saints often are people who are radically uninterested in themselves and their own rights. That requires a certain amount of strength. So with beginners, you need to give them that comfort and that affirmation, the conversation about themselves. But as they move on, they realize the self is really not worth very much. We're not really very important in the big scheme of things. The universe is pretty big. We don't live very long. Millions of people are palpably better than we are in many ways. So why bother about the self? Let's go out and see what we can do for others. Admire God's creation, worship him, but the self, who needs it? But that's a more advanced degree.